The camera pans across a sea of glittering diamonds and tailored tuxedos, the air thick with the scent of money and Dom Perignon rose. We are at the annual Metropolitan Benefactors Gala at the Pierre Hotel, the pinnacle of New York's social calendar. The voiceover is smooth, confident. In a world where power is the ultimate currency, billionaire Adrian Thorne believed he owned everything and everyone. Tonight he decided to showcase his newest acquisition, his mistress, on the grandest stage possible. He expected gas. He expected envy. What he didn't expect was his wife. He certainly didn't expect her to walk in on the arm of the one man who could destroy him with a single word. This isn't just a story of infidelity. It's a tale of a colossal miscalculation and the spectacular unraveling of a king who forgot his queen was the most powerful piece on the board. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a symphony of calculated opulence. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small carriage, dripped light onto the city's elite, their laughter echoing like the clinking of delicate champagne flutes. It was a performance, and everyone knew their part. Tonight's host was Adrian Thorne, a man who had clawed his way to the top of the real estate world, leaving a trail of broken partnerships and hostile takeovers in his wake. He stood near the entrance, a predator in a bespoke Tom Ford suit, his smile as sharp and dangerous as shattered glass. His wife, Catherine Sterling Thorne, stood a polite, calculated distance away. To the untrained eye, she was the perfect billionaire's wife, elegant in a midnight blue Oscar de la Renta gown that whispered of old money rather than shouting new wealth. Her posture was impeccable, her smile serene, a placid lake reflecting the glittering chaos around her. But beneath the surface, the waters were turbulent. For 10 years, she had lived in this gilded cage, her own ambitions and formidable intellect systematically dulled by Adrian's suffocating control. He hadn't married a partner. He had acquired a status symbol, a beautiful, pedigreed accessory from a family whose name carried more weight than his ever would. "Darling, do try to look a little less like you're attending a funeral," Adrian murmured, his hand gripping her elbow with a force that belied the affectionate term. "This is a celebration. My celebration." Catherine's smile didn't waver. "Of course, Adrian. I'm just admiring the turnout. You've certainly captured the city's attention." "I always do," he said, his gaze sweeping the room, not with pride, but with the possessive air of a conqueror surveying his territory. He thrived on this. The envy, the deference, the palpable fear. He loved the way lesser men stammered in his presence and how their wives' eyes would linger on him, a mixture of desire and intimidation. For Catherine, these events were a form of exquisite torture. She navigated the treacherous currents of high society with a grace born of breeding, exchanging pleasantries with people who saw her as little more than an extension of her husband. She spoke with councilmen about urban development policies, her insightful comments often surprising them, before Adrian would inevitably steer the conversation back to himself. She discussed art with collectors, her knowledge of provenance and technique far exceeding their own, only for Adrian to interrupt with a boast about his latest multi-million-dollar acquisition. He enjoyed diminishing her in these small, insidious ways. It was a constant reminder of her place. She had given up everything for him. When she, Sterling, had announced her intention to marry the brash, upstart Adrian Thorne, her family had been aghast. Her father, a titan of industry with a legacy stretching back generations, had given her an ultimatum: Adrian or the Sterling name and fortune. In the blinding naivete of love, she had chosen Adrian. He had promised her the world, a partnership of equals. What she received was a beautifully decorated prison where her opinions were dismissed, her friends were vetted and discarded, and her access to her own trust fund was managed by Adrian's accountants, doled out like an allowance. Tonight the air felt different, heavier. There was a nervous energy crackling beneath the surface of the polite chatter. Adrian had been more secretive than usual in the preceding weeks, taking hushed phone calls and smiling to himself with a cruel sort of glee. Catherine had learned to read these signs. He was planning something, a display of power designed to solidify his dominance. She had assumed it was another ruthless business maneuver. She was wrong. She watched as he greeted Mayor Thompson, his laughter a booming, artificial sound that commanded attention. He was in his element, the center of his own universe. A waiter offered her a glass of champagne. She took it, the cold crystal a stark contrast to the burning anxiety in her stomach. She caught her reflection in a large, gilt-edged mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, poised, beautiful, but with a hollowness in her eyes that betrayed the perfectly applied makeup. The fire she once had, the sharp intellect and fierce independence that had defined Catherine Sterling, had been banked to a low ember. But embers she knew could reignite with a single gust of wind. And tonight a hurricane was brewing. She just didn't know she would be the one to unleash it. The orchestra paused, and a hush fell over the ballroom as Adrian Thorne tapped a spoon against his crystal glass. He ascended the small dais at the front of the room, a microphone in hand, his face illuminated by a single spotlight. He looked every bit the king addressing his court, his confidence bordering on theatrical arrogance. Friends, colleagues, esteemed guests, his voice boomed, rich and self-assured. Thank you for joining me tonight to support a cause dear to my heart, the Children's Literacy Foundation. Your generosity is, as always, overwhelming. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Catherine stood near a marble column, her posture betraying none of the cold dread coiling in her gut. She had seen this look in his eyes before, the prelude to a public spectacle. He was a man who confused fear with respect, and he was about to demand a hefty tribute of both. Business is booming. Life is good, Adrian continued, his smile widening. And I've always believed in sharing my good fortune, not just through charity, but in all aspects of my life. He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes scanning the sea of faces until they landed, with deliberate precision, on Catherine. It was a warning shot, a silent command to brace herself. In recent times, I've come to realize the importance of authenticity, of living one's truth, without apology. Whispers began to snake through the room. People shifted uncomfortably. This was not the standard, self-congratulatory speech they were accustomed to. This felt personal, and public humiliation was a blood sport in these circles. And in that spirit, Adrian's voice dropped, becoming almost conspiratorial. I want to introduce someone very special to me, someone who has brought a renewed vigor into my life, a woman of incredible passion and spirit. He extended his hand, not towards Catherine, but towards the grand archway leading into the ballroom. From the shadows emerged a young woman, no older than 25, poured into a garish, fire engine, red Versace gown that screamed for attention. It was Tiffany Monroe, a former intern at Thorne Industries whose rapid ascent from the mailroom to Adrian's personal assistant had been the subject of much salacious office gossip. Tiffany glided towards the dais, her hips swaying with practiced confidence. She took Adrian's hand, her eyes alight with triumph, sweeping over the stunned audience before landing, with a flicker of smug pity, on Catherine. The gasp that went through the room was a collective, sharp intake of breath. It was one thing to have a mistress. It was another thing entirely to parade her at the year's most prestigious charity gala, an event chaired by your own wife. It was a declaration of war, a brutal and public execution of a marriage. Every eye in the room pivoted to Catherine. They expected tears, a hysterical scene, a dignified but hasty retreat. They were hungry for the drama, eager to witness the fall of the untouchable Catherine Sterling. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, she remained perfectly still, her face a mask of serene neutrality. Inside, her world had fractured. The cold dread had shattered, replaced by a white-hot, clarifying rage. The ember didn't just reignite, it exploded. Adrian placed a possessive arm around Tiffany's waist. "Please welcome Tiffany Monroe," he announced, his voice thick with smug satisfaction. "My partner in all things new and exciting." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by a few nervous coughs. The cruelty of the act was breathtaking. He hadn't just humiliated her. He had tried to erase her, to render her irrelevant in front of everyone who mattered in their world. He was rewriting their history, casting her as the old, tired past and Tiffany as the vibrant, thrilling future. Catherine's chin lifted. She met the pitying, curious, and scornful gazes of her peers without flinching. She would not give them the satisfaction of her collapse. She would not be a victim in his depraved theater. Her years of quiet observation, of enduring his psychological warfare, had forged a resilience he had fatally underestimated. Just as the whispers were about to crescendo into a roar of gossip, the massive oak doors at the far end of the ballroom opened once more. The sudden movement drew every eye. Two figures stood silhouetted against the hallway lights. As they stepped into the ballroom, another wave of murmurs, this one laced with shock and disbelief, swept through the crowd. It was Catherine, but she was not alone. On her arm was a man who radiated an aura of power so potent, it made Adrian Thorne's boisterous confidence seem like a child's tantrum. He was tall, with sharp, intelligent eyes, and an impeccably tailored suit that spoke of Savile Row, not fleeting trends. His presence was a quiet assertion of authority, the kind that doesn't need to be announced. He was Alexander Sterling, the notoriously private, formidable CEO of Sterling Enterprises, one of the few men on earth who could make Adrian Thorne feel small. And as he guided his sister, his beautifully composed, defiant sister, into the heart of the battlefield her husband had created, his expression was one of cold, lethal fury. The unveiling was over. The real show was just about to begin. The arrival of Alexander Sterling shifted the atmosphere in the ballroom instantly. If Adrian Thorne's power was a loud, crackling fire, demanding attention and consuming everything in its path, Alexander's was like the deep, inexorable pull of a tide. It was silent, immense, and utterly undeniable. Men who had been clapping for Adrian a moment before suddenly straightened their ties, their expressions turning from amusement to deference. Women who had been whispering about Catherine's predicament now looked at her with a newfound respect, mingled with awe. Alexander didn't raise his voice or make a grand gesture. He simply walked with Catherine towards the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the assembled guests with a cool, appraising look that missed nothing. He was not just a CEO, he was the scion of a dynasty. Sterling Enterprises wasn't a flashy real estate empire built on leverage and aggression like Thorne Industries. It was a global conglomerate with interests in technology, sustainable energy, and pharmaceuticals, a bastion of stability and innovation. To be in business with Sterling was a mark of ultimate success. To be on Alexander Sterling's bad side was a corporate death sentence. Adrian, still on the dais with Tiffany clinging to his arm, watched their approach, his triumphant smirk faltering. He hadn't seen Alexander in years, not since the bitter fallout over his marriage to Catherine. He had always viewed Alexander with a mixture of resentment and envy. Now, seeing him here, in this moment, a cold knot of apprehension tightened in his stomach. "Alexander," Adrian called out, forcing a jovial tone that sounded hollow and strained. "What a surprise! I wasn't aware you were on the guest list." Alexander stopped a few feet from the dais, his eyes bypassing Adrian completely to rest on Catherine. He gently squeezed her hand. "I'm not on the guest list," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel that cut through the ballroom's hushed anticipation. "I'm Catherine's guest." The statement was simple, yet its implication was a cannon blast. He wasn't here as a peer of Adrian's. He was here as Catherine's ally. He was publicly and unequivocally taking her side. Tiffany, sensing the abrupt shift in power, tightened her grip on Adrian's arm. "Well, isn't this cozy?" she simpered, her voice a little too high-pitched. "A family reunion." Alexander's gaze finally settled on her, and it was so devoid of warmth, so utterly dismissive, that Tiffany visibly flinched. He looked at her not as a person, but as an unsightly object, a piece of trash that had inexplicably found its way into a pristine environment. He didn't even grace her with a response. Instead, he turned his full attention to Adrian. "I believe you're standing in my sister's spot, Thorne," he said, his tone low and menacing. "This is her event. She is the chair of this foundation, a position she has held with grace and dedication for 5 years. You are merely the host of the venue." The public correction was surgical in its precision. In 2 sentences, Alexander had dismantled Adrian's carefully constructed image as the evening's benefactor and kingpin, recasting him as a mere functionary in his wife's world. The crowd, a fickle beast that always sided with true power, began to murmur its agreement. They remembered now. It was Catherine's passion for literacy that had elevated this gala from a minor social gathering to the premier philanthropic event of the season. Adrian's face darkened with rage. He was losing control of the narrative, of the room. "Now hold on," he blustered, stepping down from the dais. "Catherine and I are partners in this." "Are you?" Alexander countered, taking a step forward so that he and Adrian were almost face to face. Alexander was taller by a few inches, a physical advantage that only amplified his psychological dominance. "It didn't look like a partnership a moment ago. It looked like a public stoning, but you seem to have forgotten something about my sister. Sterlings aren't victims. We don't break, and we don't forget." From the corner of the room, a distinguished elderly Japanese man watched the scene unfold with keen interest. This was Mr. Kenji Tanaka, the head of the Tanaka Corporation, a global logistics giant. He was in New York to finalize a massive billion-dollar joint venture with Thorne Industries, a deal that would cement Adrian's legacy. He was also a man who valued honor, loyalty, and family above all else, and he had been a close friend and business associate of the Sterling family for decades. His face, previously a mask of polite neutrality, was now etched with a deep, unmistakable frown of disapproval. Catherine, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Her voice, though quiet, was clear and steady, imbued with a newfound strength. "Adrian," she said, looking directly at her husband, "I believe you have a choice to make. You can either ask your guest to leave, or my brother and I will." It was an ultimatum, delivered not with the hysteria he had expected, but with the calm authority of a queen reclaiming her throne. Adrian looked from Catherine's resolute face to Alexander's thunderous one, and then at the hundreds of pairs of eyes watching him, judging him. He had wanted a spectacle, and he had gotten one. But the star of the show was not him, and the story was not the one he had intended to write. For the first time that evening, and perhaps for the first time in his life, Adrian Thorne was utterly and completely outmaneuvered. Adrian Thorne was a man cornered. The alpha predator, so confident in his own territory, now found himself surrounded by a force he couldn't intimidate. He looked at Alexander, then at Catherine, his mind racing. He had built his empire on the ability to read a room, to find an opponent's weakness and exploit it. But here, the weakness was his own, laid bare for all to see. "This is a private matter between my wife and me," Adrian snarled, attempting to regain some semblance of control. "It has nothing to do with you, Alexander." Alexander let out a short, mirthless laugh. "When you publicly humiliate my sister, you make it my business. You married a Sterling, Thorne. Did you really think we would allow you to discard her like one of your failed construction projects?" A collective gasp went through the audience. While many knew Catherine came from the Sterling family, the deep rift between her and her relatives was common knowledge. They had disowned her. To see Alexander here, defending her so fiercely, was a shocking twist. Adrian seized on this, a glimmer of his old arrogance returning. "Disowned her, you mean?" he shot back, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "As I recall, you and your father wanted nothing to do with her after she chose me. A bit late to play the protective older brother, isn't it?" It was a low blow, meant to remind Catherine of the price she had paid for their marriage, to isolate her once again. But it was another fatal miscalculation. Catherine stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a fire Adrian had never seen before. "He's right, Adrian. They did. My family cut me off because they saw you for exactly what you are. A ruthless, narcissistic parasite who values acquisitions more than people. My father warned me that you would try to break me, to hollow me out until I was nothing more than a pretty ornament for your ego. And for 10 years I let you. I chose you, and in doing so, I disrespected myself and the family who loved me." Her voice trembled with emotion, but it was the tremor of strength, not weakness. "I was wrong," she said, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces in the crowd. "I was wrong to turn my back on my family. I was wrong to believe that a man like you was capable of love. And I was wrong to think I couldn't survive without you." She then turned to her brother, her expression softening. "And when I called my brother this afternoon and told him what I feared you were planning, he didn't hesitate. He didn't say, 'I told you so.' He said, "I'm on my way." That, Adrian, is family. That is loyalty. It's a concept I doubt you could ever truly understand. The revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. She had known. She had anticipated his move and had prepared a counteroffensive of her own. He had walked straight into her trap. Alexander placed a protective hand on his sister's shoulder. "For 10 years, my family has honored Catherine's choice, however painful it was for us," he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "We gave you the chance to be the man she believed you were. You have failed spectacularly. So yes, I am here to play the protective older brother. Consider Catherine's association with the Sterling family officially and publicly reinstated. She is and always has been a Sterling, and an attack on her is an attack on all of us." Tiffany Monroe, who had been watching this exchange like a spectator at a tennis match, finally seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. She wasn't just the mistress of a powerful billionaire. She was the enemy of the Sterling family, a far more ancient and formidable dynasty. The triumphant glow on her face was replaced by a pale, dawning horror. Her dream of becoming the next Mrs. Thorne was evaporating before her very eyes. Adrian stared, dumbfounded. He had thought Catherine was alone, isolated, an easy target. He had failed to comprehend the enduring power of blood ties, especially among the old money elite. He had treated his marriage like a corporate merger where he had acquired all the assets, forgetting that the most valuable asset, the Sterling name, came with a board of directors that could and would protect its own. "So, Thorne," Alexander's voice was dangerously soft now, "let me rephrase my sister's earlier proposal. You and your associate will leave this event. You will leave my sister's event now." It was not a request. It was an order. The power dynamic had been completely inverted. Adrian Thorne, the master of the universe, was being summarily dismissed from his own party, in his own hotel, in front of the very people he had sought to impress. His face was a mask of impotent fury. His public triumph curdled into the most profound and personal humiliation imaginable. The silence in the ballroom was thick with tension. Every guest was frozen, watching the tableau of power and ruin unfold. Adrian Thorne, a man accustomed to being obeyed without question, stood motionless, his face contorted in a mask of disbelief and rage. Being ordered out of his own gala was an insult of such magnitude that he couldn't immediately process it. Tiffany, however, was a creature of pure self-preservation. She saw the sinking ship and had no intention of going down with the captain. She subtly detached her arm from Adrian's, taking a small step back, a gesture of disassociation that was not missed by the eagle-eyed crowd. "This is ridiculous," Adrian finally sputtered, his voice hoarse. "This is my event. I paid for everything here. A charitable donation for which you will receive a tax receipt," Alexander replied coolly. "Nothing more. Now I suggest you leave before this becomes even more embarrassing for you." It was then that Mr. Kenji Tanaka, the venerable head of the Tanaka Corporation, began to walk slowly and deliberately toward the central group. His presence commanded a different kind of respect, one born of decades of integrity and shrewd business acumen. As he approached, a path cleared for him. He stopped not in front of Adrian, but in front of Catherine. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of profound respect. "Catherine-san," he said, his English precise and formal, "it is a great relief to see your brother by your side. Family is the bedrock upon which all honorable enterprises are built." He then turned to Adrian, his expression one of deep disappointment. "Thorne-san," he said, the honorific now sounding like an indictment. "Tanaka Corporation has been in partnership with Sterling Enterprises for over 40 years. It is a relationship built on trust, mutual respect, and honor. I came here tonight believing that a man who had married into such a family would share those values." Adrian's eyes widened in panic. The billion-dollar joint venture was the cornerstone of his company's 5-year plan. Without it, Thorne Industries would be dangerously overleveraged. "Mr. Tanaka," he began, his voice taking on a desperate, pleading tone, "this is a private misunderstanding. It has no bearing on our business." Mr. Tanaka held up a hand, silencing him. "A man who cannot honor his own wife, who would seek to humiliate the mother of his children." He paused, though Catherine and Adrian had no children. The sentiment was clear. In such a dishonorable fashion is not a man I can trust with the future of my company. A man's character is not separate from his business. It is the foundation of it. You have shown me your foundation is rotten. He turned to his aide, who stood nearby, and spoke a few words in Japanese. The aide nodded, then looked at Adrian. Mr. Tanaka wishes to inform you that our preliminary agreement is terminated, effective immediately. We will be issuing a press release in the morning. The words struck Adrian like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his face draining of all color. This wasn't just public humiliation anymore. This was financial annihilation. The loss of the Tanaka deal would send shockwaves through the financial markets. Thorne Industries' stock would plummet. His creditors would get nervous. The entire house of cards he had so carefully constructed was beginning to tremble. He whirled on Tiffany, his eyes wild with fury. "This is your fault," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "You and your greed." Tiffany looked at him, her expression a mixture of fear and contempt. "My fault?" she retorted, her voice shaking. "You were the one who wanted a show, Adrian. I just wore the costume you picked out for me. Don't blame me because your wife brought a bigger army." Without another word, she turned and fled, her red dress a slash of color as she disappeared through the crowd, leaving him utterly alone. Adrian's frantic gaze swept the room, searching for a friendly face, an ally. He found none. His so-called friends avoided his eyes, suddenly fascinated by their champagne glasses or the ceiling architecture. The city's elite had smelled blood in the water, and they were sharks. They would circle, but they would not help. They would simply wait to feast on the wreckage. He looked at Catherine, a storm of hatred and desperation in his eyes. He had wanted to destroy her, but in his hubris, he had orchestrated his own spectacular downfall. She met his gaze, not with triumph, not with pity, but with a calm, unnerving serenity. It was the look of a woman who had already won, long before the first shot was fired. Defeated and utterly broken, Adrian Thorne turned and stalked out of the ballroom, the whispers and stares of his former admirers following him like a funeral dirge. The king had been dethroned. As the doors swung shut behind Adrian, a collective exhale seemed to pass through the ballroom. The immediate drama was over, but the full extent of the evening's repercussions was just beginning to be understood. Alexander put a comforting arm around Catherine, guiding her away from the center of the room toward a quieter alcove. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice laced with genuine concern. "I am now," she said, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time that night. It felt strange, like using a muscle that had long since atrophied. "Thank you, Alexander. I couldn't have." "You could have," he interrupted gently, "but you shouldn't have had to do it alone. Never again." What Alexander and the rest of the room didn't yet realize was that Catherine hadn't been waiting for a rescue. She had been laying a meticulously planned trap. His arrival had been the cavalry, but she had already mined the battlefield. A man in a sober, dark suit, who had been standing discreetly near the back of the room, now approached them. This was Michael Donovan, Catherine's lawyer, and, not coincidentally, one of the top corporate litigation attorneys in the country, retained by Sterling Enterprises. "Michael," Catherine greeted him, her voice now crisp and businesslike. The transformation was startling. The serene, long-suffering wife had vanished, replaced by a woman of formidable intellect and purpose. "Catherine, Alexander," Donovan nodded to them both. "Everything is in place." Catherine opened her small, elegant clutch. From it, she produced not a lipstick or a compact, but a slim, encrypted USB drive. She handed it to Donovan. "This is everything, Michael," she said. "The offshore accounts, the falsified environmental reports for the Hudson Yards project, the insider trading scheme with Senator Wilkes, the shell corporations he used to hide assets before our prenup was signed. It's all there, cross-referenced with authenticated documentation for every transaction." Alexander stared at his sister, his initial surprise quickly morphing into profound admiration. "Catherine, how long?" "A long time," she replied, her gaze distant for a moment. "For years, Adrian treated me like a decorative fool. He would take business calls in front of me, leave sensitive documents on his desk, convinced I was too stupid or too uninterested to understand them. He underestimated me. That was his first and final mistake. She had started small, driven by a gnawing suspicion about their finances. Using the business acumen she had inherited from her father and honed at Wharton before she had met Adrian, she began to piece things together. She secretly reactivated her old network of contacts, hired a discreet forensic accountant, and spent countless nights after Adrian was asleep, piecing together the puzzle of his corrupt empire. She wasn't just looking for evidence of infidelity. She was conducting a full-scale corporate investigation. The plan was never just to leave him. The plan was to dismantle him, to ensure he could never again use his wealth and power to destroy another person's life. His affair with Miss Monroe was just the final insult, Catherine explained, her voice hardening. The last piece of leverage I needed. His decision to humiliate me so publicly provides us with a clear character argument to invalidate the more restrictive clauses of the prenuptial agreement. He handed me the moral high ground on a silver platter. Michael Donovan examined the drive. With this and the public termination of the Tanaka deal, Thorne Industries will be insolvent by the end of the quarter. The SEC will open an investigation by morning. The district attorney's office will likely follow. He won't just lose his company, Catherine. He'll be lucky to stay out of federal prison. The sheer scale of her gambit was breathtaking. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act of revenge. It was a long, cold, calculated campaign executed with the precision of a master strategist. She had endured the humiliation, the isolation, and the emotional abuse, all while quietly gathering the weapons that would guarantee his complete and utter destruction. She hadn't just checkmated him, she had burned the entire chessboard. Alexander looked at the woman beside him, seeing not just his beloved little sister, but a formidable power in her own right. The sterling fire, the intelligence, the ruthless, strategic mind. It had never been extinguished. It had simply been dormant, waiting for the right moment to roar back to life. Catherine Sterling Thorne was gone. In her place stood Catherine Sterling, and she was taking back everything that had been stolen from her, with interest. The aftermath was swift and brutal. As Michael Donovan predicted, the news of the terminated Tanaka deal hit the markets before the opening bell. Thorne Industries' stock plummeted by 70% in the first hour of trading. By noon, the SEC had announced a formal investigation into the company's accounting practices, citing anonymous but highly credible evidence. Adrian Thorne's name, once a symbol of audacious success, was now synonymous with disgrace and corporate malfeasance. His photograph was splashed across the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Not as a titan of industry, but as a cornered white-collar criminal. He was buried in lawsuits from shareholders, and federal marshals raided his Park Avenue office, carrying out boxes of evidence. His fair-weather friends vanished, their phone numbers suddenly disconnected. His banks called in their loans. Within a month, Thorne Industries filed for bankruptcy, and Adrian Thorne was indicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. The empire he had built on a foundation of lies had crumbled to dust. Catherine, in stark contrast, was experiencing a renaissance. She shed the name Thorne as if it were a heavy, suffocating coat. Reclaiming her maiden name, Catherine Sterling became the city's most talked-about figure, not for the scandal, but for her quiet strength and staggering intelligence. The Sterling family welcomed her back with open arms and profound regret for the lost years. Her father, his health failing, tearfully apologized for his ultimatum, admitting it was the biggest mistake of his life. He had seen the predator in Adrian, but had used the wrong tactics to protect his daughter, inadvertently pushing her away. A few weeks after the gala, Catherine stood in the expansive, sunlit boardroom on the top floor of the Sterling Enterprises building, overlooking Central Park. The view was a panorama of the city she was reclaiming as her own. She was no longer just a resident of a gilded cage. She was a player in the city's future. Alexander entered the room holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her. "The board just approved your proposal," he said, his voice filled with pride. "The Sterling Foundation for Ethical Entrepreneurship is officially a go. You have a starting endowment of $500 million. Catherine had refused to simply return to a life of quiet luxury. She had pitched an ambitious new philanthropic venture to the board, a foundation dedicated to funding and mentoring startups that prioritized ethical practices, environmental sustainability, and employee welfare. It was the antithesis of everything Adrienne Thorne had stood for. It was her way of turning the poison of her past into an antidote for the future. "Thank you, Alexander," she said, her voice steady, "for believing in me." "How could I not?" he replied, smiling. "You're my sister. You're the smartest person I know. I just wish I hadn't let my own pride keep us apart for so long." "We have time to make up for it," she said, looking out at the sprawling city below. Her phone buzzed. It was a news alert. A blurry photo showed Tiffany Monroe boarding a flight to an obscure European country, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. She had disappeared, another casualty of Adrienne's catastrophic ego. Catherine felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a sense of waste. Tiffany had been a weapon in Adrienne's war, and like most weapons, she had been discarded when she was no longer useful. The media frenzy had died down, but requests for an exclusive interview still poured in. She had refused them all until now. Later that day, she would sit down with a respected journalist, not to rehash the sordid details of her marriage, but to announce the launch of her foundation. She would control the narrative. Her story would not be defined by Adrienne's betrayal, but by her own resilience and vision. She took a sip of her coffee, the warmth spreading through her. The past 10 years had been a cold, lonely winter, but spring had finally arrived. She was no longer Adrienne Thorne's wife, a society hostess, or a victim. She was Catherine Sterling, a philanthropist, a business leader, a survivor. She was free, and as she looked out at the endless possibilities of the New York City skyline, she knew with absolute certainty that this was not an ending. It was a spectacular new beginning. 2 years had passed since the night the Thorne empire crumbled in the grand ballroom of the Pierre. The seasons had turned, the news cycle had moved on, and the name Adrienne Thorne had faded from the headlines into the footnotes of corporate scandal history. But for Catherine Sterling, time had not simply passed. It had been reclaimed, reshaped, and repurposed into a future she had built with her own hands. Tonight, she stood on a different kind of stage. It was not a gilded dais in a stuffy ballroom, but a modern, minimalist platform in a converted Soho loft. The space was buzzing with a vibrant, youthful energy, filled with ambitious entrepreneurs, tech journalists, and venture capitalists. This was the second annual summit for the Sterling Foundation for Ethical Entrepreneurship. Instead of Dom Perignon, guests drank craft beer and kombucha. Instead of diamonds, they wore smartwatches and expressions of keen intelligence. Catherine wore a simple, elegant navy blue pantsuit by the row, her hair cut in a chic, practical bob. She radiated an approachable authority, a warmth that invited collaboration rather than demanding deference. She was in the middle of a passionate conversation with a young woman named Lena Petrova, the CEO of Verdant, a startup her foundation had provided seed funding for. Verdant had developed a revolutionary biodegradable alternative to plastic packaging, and their first major distribution deal had just been announced. The key was altering the polymer chain at a microbial level, Lena was explaining, her eyes bright with excitement. "It's strong, it's cheap to produce, and in a landfill it disappears completely in 90 days. Your team's mentorship on the supply chain logistics was the game changer, Catherine. We couldn't have scaled without it." "You had the genius idea, Lena," Catherine said, her smile genuine. "We just helped clear the path. That's what the foundation is for, to prove that you can build a successful company without cutting ethical corners." A reporter from Forbes snapped a picture of them, a genuine moment of mentorship and triumph. This was her new reality, tangible, meaningful, and entirely her own. She was no longer a reflection of a powerful man, but a source of power for others. Her work wasn't about charity galas and posing for cameras. It was about fostering real innovation that could change the world, one brilliant mind at a time. Later, as the event wound down, her lawyer, Michael Donovan, found her near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Manhattan nightscape. He looked older than he had 2 years ago, his hair now more silver than black, but his eyes held the same sharp intelligence. "A wonderful event, Catherine," he said, accepting a glass of sparkling water from a server. "A far cry from the Pierre." "Thank goodness for that," she laughed. "I'll take this over society's piranha pool any day." His expression turned serious. "I have some news. I didn't want to email you about it." Adrienne Thorne's final appeal was denied this morning by the Second Circuit Court. It's over. He'll serve the full 12 years. The name, once a source of searing pain and rage, now landed with a dull, distant thud. 12 years, it seemed both an eternity and not nearly enough. For a moment she was silent, watching the endless stream of headlights on the street below. She felt no triumph, no vindictive pleasure. She just felt quiet. It was the quiet of a war finally, definitively ending. "Thank you for telling me in person, Michael," she said softly. He nodded, understanding her subdued reaction. "There's one more thing. As part of his pre-sentencing statement, he requested to see you. You are under no obligation, of course. I would advise against it." Catherine considered his words. The old Catherine would have recoiled in horror. The thought of being in the same room as Adrian, of breathing the same air, would have been suffocating. But she was no longer that woman. She had spent 2 years building a life so full and vibrant that his memory had begun to lose its sharp edges, fading like an old photograph. Perhaps, she thought, seeing him one last time was necessary to burn the photograph completely. "I'll do it," she said, her decision surprising both Michael and herself. "I want to see him." A week later, she was buzzed through a series of heavy steel doors at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. The air was sterile, smelling of disinfectant and despair. The opulence of their former life, the polished marble, the scent of fresh-cut flowers, the soft wool of bespoke suits, was a universe away. Here, everything was concrete, steel, and muted shades of institutional gray. She was led to a small, bare room divided by a thick pane of plexiglass. She sat on a hard plastic stool and waited. A few moments later, a door on the other side opened, and Adrian was led in. The transformation was shocking. He wore a drab, ill-fitting prison jumpsuit. The charismatic, commanding billionaire was gone. The man who sat opposite her was a ghost. He was gaunt. His skin had a sickly pallor, and his eyes, once so full of arrogant fire, were hollow and haunted. He had aged 20 years. The power, the swagger, the very essence of the man he had been stripped away, leaving behind something weak and pathetic. He picked up the receiver on his side of the glass. She did the same. "Catherine," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "Adrian," she replied, her tone even, neutral. For a long moment, he just stared at her, his eyes searching her face. He seemed to be looking for something, a flicker of pity, a hint of the woman he once controlled. He found nothing but calm, impenetrable composure. "You look well," he finally said. "I am," she confirmed. "I read about your foundation," he continued, a bitter edge to his voice. "The saint of second chances. How noble. Building your new kingdom on the ashes of mine." "This has nothing to do with you, Adrian," she said, her voice remaining steady. "My work isn't a reaction to you. You are no longer the center of my universe. In fact, you're not in it at all." His face twisted into a sneer. "Don't pretend you're not enjoying this. You destroyed me. You took everything. You did this to yourself," she stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. "You built a life on deceit, and it collapsed. That's gravity, not my doing. The documents I gave Michael, they weren't a weapon I created. They were a diary of your own choices. I just held up a mirror, and you didn't like the reflection." He slumped in his chair, the brief flash of anger gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading look. "Catherine, please. You have to help me. Talk to the prosecutor. Your family has influence. You could get my sentence reduced. I can't survive 12 years in here." And there it was, the reason for his request. Not remorse, not a need for closure, but one last, desperate attempt at manipulation. He still saw her as a tool to be used. The realization was profoundly liberating. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting his through the thick glass. "Listen to me very carefully, Adrian. I am not here for you. I am here for me. I am here to look at what's left of the man who tried to break me and feel absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, no fear. Just closure." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You asked me to come here because you still believe you have some hold over me. You think I am still your wife, an extension of your will. But that woman is gone. You erased her, and in her place, a woman you never knew and could never comprehend was born. She stood up, placing the receiver back in its cradle. Goodbye, Adrian. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, but you will never see or hear from me again. He started shouting her name, his voice distorted and tinny through the glass, his hands banging on the partition, but she didn't look back. She walked out of the room, through the steel doors and back into the bright afternoon sun, leaving the ghost of her past to fade away in his concrete box. That evening, she found herself not in a boardroom or at a gala, but in a small, unassuming Italian restaurant in the West Village, a place she and Alexander had gone to as children. They sat at a corner table, sharing a bottle of Chianti. He was small, she said, recounting the prison visit. Everything about him, his voice, his presence, it was all gone. Alexander reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Because it was never real. It was a performance, and the show is over. They ate and talked for hours, not about Adrian, but about everything else. About a new Sterling Enterprises initiative in renewable energy she was advising on. About their father's last days, and how he had spent them telling everyone how proud he was of his daughter. About a silly memory from a childhood vacation. They were rebuilding their lost decade, one shared story at a time. Walking home later, she bypassed the waiting car and driver, choosing instead to walk the 20 blocks to her apartment. The city was alive around her, the murmur of conversations from cafes, the distant wail of a siren, the rhythm of 1,000 different lives intersecting. She felt a part of it, not an observer looking down from a penthouse window. She was grounded. She was whole. Her name, Catherine Sterling, was no longer just a legacy she had been born into. It was a title she had earned, forged in fire, and defined by her own actions. The weight of it was no longer a burden, but an anchor, holding her steady in the beautiful, unpredictable current of the life that was now, finally hers. So, what is the ultimate lesson from Catherine Sterling's incredible story? It's a powerful reminder that the quietest person in the room is often the most observant, and underestimating someone based on their silence is a fool's game. True power isn't about loud boasts and public displays. It's about meticulous planning, unwavering resolve, and the courage to reclaim your own narrative. Catherine didn't just get revenge. She achieved justice and rebuilt her life on her own terms, turning her pain into purpose. Her story proves that the best comeback is not just surviving, but thriving in a way your enemies never thought possible. If Catherine's journey from a gilded cage to the head of the boardroom resonated with you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with anyone who needs a reminder of their own inner strength. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story of epic triumphs and spectacular comebacks. Thank you for listening.